The morning Daniel handed me the eviction notice, he was wearing the same smile he'd had as a boy whenever he'd broken something and tried to hide it behind charm. Except this time, he wasn't 8 years old with a shattered vase. He was 43, wearing a pressed collar shirt, and the thing he was breaking was me. "It's just paperwork, Mom," he said, setting the envelope on my kitchen table, the one his grandfather had built by hand from oak pulled off this very property. "Veronica, and I think it would be best if you had your own space. Something smaller, more manageable." I looked at the envelope, then I looked at my son. Then I looked around the kitchen where I had taught him to make biscuits, where I had held him through 2 broken hearts and 1 broken arm, where his father had died with his hand in mine 6 years ago. "Manageable," I repeated. Daniel nodded, his eyes sliding sideways the way they always did when he couldn't quite meet my gaze. "You're 67, Mom. This house is 4,000 square feet. The property is 12 acres. It's too much for one person." What he didn't say, what he carefully arranged his words to avoid saying, was that 3 months earlier, I had signed a document his wife Veronica had placed in front of me at Sunday dinner. A document she'd explained was a family estate planning form. A document that, as I would later discover, had quietly transferred the deed to the country house, the house my husband Robert had built, the house that had been in our family for 31 years, into Veronica's name. I had signed it with the same trust I'd given Daniel the day he was born. That trust, it turned out, had a price. You need to understand something about Veronica before this story goes any further, because she is not a monster. Monsters are easy. Monsters have sharp edges you can see coming. Veronica was something far more complicated. She was a woman of extraordinary ambition wrapped in the appearance of warmth, and she had recognized in my son a man who would follow the path of least resistance all the way to the edge of a cliff if she pointed him in the right direction and made it look like a scenic overlook. She had entered Daniel's life 8 years ago. At a charity gala he'd attended more for the open bar than any philanthropic impulse. She was beautiful, still was, with a lawyer's precision and a socialite's smile. Within 6 months they were engaged. Within a year married. Within 2 years I had started noticing small things. The way Sunday dinners became monthly dinners, then occasional dinners. The way Daniel stopped calling just to talk and started calling only when something needed doing. A signature, a reference, a favor. The way Veronica would look at the country house whenever they visited, her eyes moving across the rooms with a particular kind of attention. Not the attention of someone enjoying a space, the attention of someone measuring one. But I told myself I was imagining things, because that's what mothers do. We sand down our instincts to protect our children's happiness, even when our children are grown, even when their happiness is being constructed on a foundation that has nothing to do with us. The document at Sunday dinner was the masterpiece of a long and patient campaign. I didn't react the way Daniel expected me to when he left that morning with the eviction notice on my table. I think he expected tears, maybe anger, possibly the kind of wounded guilt trip that mothers are famous for, the slow emotional siege that would make him feel terrible and ultimately change nothing. I think Veronica had prepared him for all of those, coached him on how to respond to each one, given him phrases to deploy like small, careful weapons. "You'll be hupaka somewhere with a community. We're thinking of your health. The upkeep on a property this size is dangerous at your age." What he was not prepared for was my stillness. I picked up the envelope. I looked at it for a long moment, and then I set it back down, walked to the stove, and finished making my coffee. "I'll need 60 days, I said. Daniel blinked. This was not in the script. "Mom." 60 days, Daniel, surely that's reasonable. He hesitated, recalibrating, then he nodded. "Of course, we're not trying to rush you." "I know," I said pleasantly. He left 20 minutes later, and the sound of his car on the gravel driveway was the sound of a door closing on a version of my life I hadn't known was already over. Then I sat down at that oak table, drank my coffee, and began to think. Here is what they did not know about me. They knew Alana Marsh, the widow, the gentle, gardening, biscuit-making mother who cried at television commercials and kept photographs of her grandchildren she didn't have yet on a wish list in her bedside drawer. They knew the woman who brought casseroles to sick neighbors and had never, in 40 years of marriage, raised her voice at a man in public. What they did not know was that before I married Robert Marsh at 26, I had spent 4 years working for a property law firm in the city, not as a secretary, as a paralegal, a very good one, with a particular specialty in estate litigation. What they did not know was that I had spent the 6 years since Robert's death not merely gardening and grieving, but also quietly, carefully managing the financial legacy he'd left. Investments Daniel had never asked about because he'd always assumed his father's wealth was modest and his mother's mind was soft. And what they most critically did not know was that I had read that Sunday dinner document very carefully the night after I signed it, that I had photographed every page, that I had sent those photographs to an old colleague named Mugrat Shah, who was now one of the most respected property law attorneys in the state. Mugrat had called me 2 days later. "Ulana," she'd said, "I don't want to alarm you." "Then don't," I'd said, "just tell me what my options are." The 60 days I asked for were not 60 days of packing. They were 60 days of the most purposeful work I had done since raising a child, and I approached them with the same meticulous energy. Mugrat and I met 3 times in those weeks, at a diner 40 minutes from the property, where I was confident Veronica's network of carefully maintained social connections would not extend. What Mugrat had found in the document was not a clean, airtight transfer. It was a document with problems, serious ones. The Nuttars Utpun had been performed by a notary who was also, as it happened, an employee of the real estate firm where Veronica sat on the advisory board. A conflict of interest elegant enough to constitute fraud. But that was only the beginning. Robert, in his quiet and thorough way, had established something I had known about and Daniel had not: a revocable living trust created in 2019. That placed the country house in trust for my lifetime benefit. The document Veronica had prepared and I had signed was a quitclaim deed, a mechanism that under ordinary circumstances would have overridden the trust. But the trust had a clause Robert's attorney had insisted upon and Robert, who had known his son longer than Veronica had agreed to. No transfer of the property would be valid without the independent written consent of the trustee. The trustee was not me, it was not Daniel, it was Margaret Chu. I had named Margaret trustee in 2019, 3 weeks after I had noticed Veronica looking at the country house with measuring eyes for the first time, and I had done it quietly, the way you buy insurance you hope you'll never need. I had never mentioned it to anyone. Not even Daniel. The letter arrived at Veronica's law firm on a Tuesday morning, 51 days into my 60-day window. I was in the garden when Daniel called, not texted, which told me everything about the state of his composure. His voice was several notes higher than usual and stripped of all its Sunday dinner pleasantness. "Mom, what is this letter?" "Which letter, sweetheart?" I was deadheading roses. It is a useful activity when you need to keep your hands busy and your voice calm. "From a Margaret Chu, saying that the deed transfer is being contested and that there's some kind of trust." "Ah," I said, "yes, that would be your father." Silence, the particular silence of a man recalculating a situation he thought he had completely mapped. "I don't understand." "Your father was a careful man, Daniel, you know that. He set up a trust without telling me." "He set up a trust," I said, "to protect this house. For me, for as long as I'm living, which I should mention I intend to be for quite some time." Another silence, longer and more turbulent. Veronica says. "Daniel," my voice was still pleasant, still warm, but under the warmth something that had been bending for 31 years finally, quietly straightened. "I don't want to hear what Veronica says. I want to talk to my son. Can you do that? Can you be my son for 5 minutes without being Veronica's husband?" The silence that followed that was the longest one yet. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was smaller. It was the voice of a boy who has broken something and has run out of ways to hide it. "Mom," he said, "what did I do?" The legal process took 4 months and ended not in a courtroom, but in a mediator's office, which is where Veronica, to her credit, ultimately agreed it should end. She was too good an attorney to take a case she couldn't win to trial, and Margaret had built a case she could not win. The quitclaim deed was invalidated. The conflict of interest notarization was referred to the state bar. The country house returned to exactly where it had always legally been, in trust for my lifetime, which meant mine, which meant home. What surprised me, what I had not predicted, even with all my preparation, was what happened with Daniel. I had expected the legal victory. I had not expected the phone call on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks after the mediation concluded, when Daniel called and asked if he could come to the country house for the weekend, without Veronica. I said yes. He arrived Saturday morning looking like a man who had lost weight he hadn't needed to lose and was sleeping in increments. He sat at the oak table, and I made coffee, and for a long time neither of us said anything, which was its own kind of conversation, one we'd been having his whole life in this kitchen. Finally, he said, "She told me you would never notice the document." "I know," I said. "She said it was the most efficient solution for the estate." "I know." I wanted to believe her. He wrapped both hands around his mug. It was easier to believe her than to think about what it would mean, what I would be doing to you. I looked at my son. I had been looking at him for 43 years, as a wailing newborn, as a gap-toothed child, as a teenager who thought he knew everything, as a man who had made a catastrophic choice in a weak moment and had spent 4 months living in the wreckage of it. Why, I asked, not angrily. I genuinely wanted to know. He was quiet for a while. Then, "She makes everything feel urgent, like if we don't act now something will be lost, and I didn't want to lose her." "You almost lost me," I said. "I know," his voice cracked on the second word. "Mom, I know. I want to be honest about the ending of this story, because easy endings are lies, and I am 67 years old and too tired for lies. Daniel and Veronica are still married. I don't know for how long, that's not my verdict to give. What I know is that he goes to therapy now, which he had never been willing to do before, and that he calls me on Thursdays just to talk, which was the pattern we had before Veronica and lost somewhere along the way to becoming her husband. Veronica has not come to the country house since the mediation. I don't expect her to, and I don't expect an apology. Apologies require a particular kind of self-examination that I'm not certain she's capable of, and that's not a condemnation, it's just an assessment based on evidence, and I've spent too much of my life in evidence-based fields to pretend otherwise. The house is still mine. It will be mine until I die, and after that it goes to a land conservancy Robert and I established in 2018, which was a decision we made together one evening on the back porch with a bottle of wine and a conversation about what we wanted to leave in the world. That decision, too, Veronica did not know about. There are rose bushes along the eastern fence that I planted the spring after Robert died, one for every year we were married, 31 of them. I go out every morning with my coffee and walk along the fence and think about him, and about the house, and about what it means to build a life somewhere. Not in a property law sense, though I understand that too, but in the way that time and love and grief accumulate in the walls of a place until the place itself becomes part of you. Daniel came out to the fence with me on his last visit. We stood there in the early light and he asked me how I'd known, how I'd had the trust set up, the trustee named, the whole architecture in place before anything had happened. I didn't know, I said, not specifically. Then why? I thought about Veronica's eyes moving across these rooms with that particular measuring attention. I thought about Sunday dinners becoming monthly dinners. I thought about all the small instincts I had sanded down to protect my son's happiness, and about the one instinct I hadn't, the one that had sent me to Margaret Chu's office in 2019 with a copy of the trust documents under my arm. "Because your father taught me that love isn't enough," I said, "you also need to be prepared." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way he does when he's filing something away in a permanent place. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. The rose bushes were just beginning to open. The morning was clear and cold, and smelled like the earth after rain. 12 acres of it, all around us, all mine. "I know you are," I said. "And for now, for this morning, for this fence line and this light, and this son standing next to me trying to find his way back to something he'd nearly thrown away, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was home."